Word that gives us such practical guidance.
All right.
May we be wonderful expressions of your authority.
I know no one likes being on
In
camera,
Jesus'
but
name, amen.
I'm do it anyway. All right, how's everybody doing?
Good.
What? How's the angle? Is it okay? There you go.
You're still not on.
Okay, so
You're not
just a few things. One is that
Yeah.
it's because it's delayed. It's okay. Oh yeah, that's live. Yes. Next week we are not meeting. Just FYI. So don't forget that. All right. So for those of you online, just know that we're not meeting next week. Okay. So this week we're going to go a little bit deeper into corporal discipline, corporal punishment, and whatever you want to call it, spanking, the rod. So for those of you who missed last week, I think it'll be a good refresher as to think through that a little bit. There were a few things that he mentioned beforehand, and before we go into some of the practical details of these. One of which was this idea of a lack of honor. In other words, when your child gives you a lack of honor or doesn't give you the honor that you deserve as his or her parent. Have you ever experienced that? Yes? How have you handled that, generally? I'm going to give you a few examples of what a lack of honor looks like, okay? Because you hear that expression and you're probably thinking, well, what does that really mean? Okay, so he talked about something, but one is when your child demands something of you. Give me. Has your child ever done that? Give me something, right? Rather than saying, Daddy, may I please have a da-da-da-da, or Mom, may I please have. It's give me. So that's the first. So really a sense of self-centeredness and a real absence of politeness. And remember, politeness is not simply a ritual, but it's a verbal expression of their sense of submission to you as someone who is over them. And that's something that, so one is demand without respect. Another is hitting you. Hitting you. Does your child ever hit you? Or a subset of hitting is, say, spitting or pushing or kicking or whatever it is, or making fun of you, any way in which they substantially undermine you. Another one is, and this is probably one that you all have faced, I know I have many times, which is no. When you ask them to do something, they say no. Or when you ask them to give you something, they say no. Or go to bed, no. Whatever it might be. Eat this, no. Okay? Refusal to listen in a timely fashion, which we talked about last week. That when you ask them to do something, they might do it eventually, but it takes you a real battle to get to that place. And a refusal to accept help in need. And he talked about that when tying shoelaces, let's say, and as you're saying, let mommy help you, and they push your hand away. No, I'm going to do it myself. So those are just some examples of an example of a lack of honor or respect. So any of you ever faced that before?
Yeah.
Okay, so out of that list, a few, one or two, or all the above. Anyone face all the above?
Most.
Most. Okay. Let me address a couple of them that are, I think, a little bit more substantial than others. What about hitting? Any of your kids hit you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So how have you generally responded to that?
Had to talk.
Okay.
To them.
Had you talked to them?
I've talked, yeah.
Okay.
Talked to them.
Okay.
Yelled at them.
Okay. You said, no hitting daddy.
I've said that before. I took this class and now I say different things. No, seriously though. Before that, it was definitely like, no hitting, you know.
Okay, what about Leslie? Okay, you both shake your heads.
We tried timeout, talking
Uh-huh.
to Dean, spanking. I know this is not. I know this is not what I should do, but I just wanted to see his response.
Mhm.
So he hit me. So I hit him back.
Uh-huh.
Then he hit me again. I hit him back, and it went back and forth maybe like 4 times. Not hard,
Sure,
but just
sure.
And then he just broke down and wanted me to hug him.
And then you say, oh, oh, dude, I'm so sorry. Okay. I think, anyone else have their children hit them?
Kids biting.
Okay. Biting. Biting is a real, it's not just towards parents, but when it happens towards other children, that can be quite unnerving. Anyone have their children, your child bitten by another child?
My child has bitten.
One of my kids was the object of another child biting them over and over repeatedly. And this is in a community group. And so it was very, very difficult of a scenario for us. Very, very hard. Hard to be the biter, and it's hard to be the bitten one. So, well, I'll give you that scenario later on. But anyone else? Okay. I'm sure the other ones you probably experienced to some extent, whether it's saying no, refusal to listen. So here's the thing: is that you have to understand that your child, and if you, again, this starts at the very beginning of where we began this class with, which is, I told you there were going to be some presuppositions. And one of the fundamental presuppositions of our class is that we believe the Bible to be true, and the means by which we get the ability to know how to live the life that we live. Without that presupposition, it's really difficult, because if I were to say, well, here's why we should do this, because the Bible tells us that this is the path upon which we find our greatest joy, and if you say, well, I don't believe the Bible to be that, then we're really at a loss. We have no ability to connect. But I'm going to assume, for our sake, because if someone said, no, the Bible isn't true, then that's a whole other discussion, probably another class, another whole class of stuff. But I'm going to assume the Bible to be true, and one of the things that he notes is that Proverbs brings up a lot of wisdom as to how to rear our children, especially when they're young. And some key points that Proverbs makes is that children, and all people really, it's not just children, but people, when we were young, we are born with a heart of foolishness. We have no desire for God at all. And a fool is, I think he talked about it, he defined it as someone who follows, I don't know if the most dangerous thing in the child's heart is foolishness. A fool sees the world inside out and upside down. They see things not as it is. So when a child, and he gave the example, if a child wants to stay up all night long, and you say, no, you need your sleep, you have to go to sleep, that child thinks that by staying up, it's to their best good, because that's what they want. And they feel as though that's the best thing for them. You, as someone who knows really what's best for them in that instance, when you're telling them you have to go to sleep, their foolish heart is unable to recognize that they're really downward spiraling into this terrible place, because I know all of you experienced that, where they're so tired that they're worked up and they go into this frenzy because now they're so tired they can't even sleep, right? And they can't see that they've turned into a fool, but they've always been that way to begin with. And we are here to try to lead and shepherd them so that they wouldn't be a fool. So I know we don't like that word fool because it makes it sound as though we're talking about kids being idiots, and that's far from the truth. In fact, we've talked about the fact that we really believe that children are very insightful. They're like sponges. They soak up a lot of information. They're able to process things far more than we can really even imagine them processing. So it's not about an inability or intelligence. It's about the way upon which they view the world and how especially they view the world in view of who God is. And so if we assume that that is the case, then you have to know that when they're approaching you that way, they're acting upon which they know of themselves, which is their hearts are foolish. They go against the very things that bring life to them. And the real question is, how do we get them out of that? So there are a lot of different ways that we can approach it, but the Bible's number one approach to this is physical discipline, the rod. Folly, Proverbs 22:15, folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from it. And let me say that this is probably one of the biggest challenges you will face, not just with discipline, but parenting, period. You know what the number one problem is? The most difficult part of parenting is? What would you imagine it being? This is my problem. I'm assuming it's yours, but
The separation, the independence.
that's hard. That's really frustrating. But I think for me, as me a parent to that child, it's consistency. It's very hard to, you know what I mean? It's hard to be consistent all the time. I might know what I should do, but circumstances often make it quite difficult to regularly be consistent. Do you find that to be the case? Now here's the thing is that if we are consistent with our kids, they will be able to know how they can respond to circumstances, where they should go. But when we're inconsistent, it makes it very difficult for them to process things. I mean, think about that. That's the case with us as adults, isn't it? I mean, think about how many times you have a marital conflict and you're always pointing out, well, you're not consistent with what you've said in the past. And when that happens, it's really frustrating, isn't it? In marriage, right? When you feel as though one spouse has constantly given a double standard and you feel as though there's no sense of consistency. What do you think? That's hard, right? Well, at least you have experience and life experience to process that and try to work it out. But a child, it's very hard. So if in one instance, and he talked about this, the concept of a child having to read your mood. Doesn't that stink? You know? Well, what do you all think about that? You ever grow up with that in your own household when you were a young child with your parents? Anyone have more moody parents where mom or dad was, can be set off very easily, or you felt as though you need to walk on eggshells every once in a while? Anyone grow up with that?
I totally did with my stepdad.
How did it make you feel?
Oh, scared all the time.
Yeah.
Like every time I would walk into the house, I would kind of listen to see if he was mumbling to himself, because that was the key. If he was mumbling to himself, then that would mean that he had a bad day.
So what if he was doing well?
He would be singing.
He would be what?
Singing.
He would be singing. And how did that make you feel, Gloria?
Like the video said, like it's when you hear the humming or the singing, then it's the right time to ask for something. And when you hear the mumbling, then you just hide.
Yeah. It's miserable, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And Leslie, you grew up with that?
Same thing. My stepmom.
Anyone else grow up with that? Okay. Creates fear?
I was just stupid, I still asked.
I grew up with that. It's terrible. But I wonder if, and I never thought about me being that way. I fight it, but I know I have that tendency. I have a feeling that we probably are like this more than we realize. You know, and our children, because they are somewhat insightful, they are somewhat assessing regularly where you're at. And you ever find that sometimes you're really playful with your kids, and then sometimes you're just totally not? You want to be distanced from them? What is it that creates that? Like, why is it that sometimes we can be so playful with our kids and have so much fun, next thing we know, we're so tired of them and want them away from us?
Selfishness, right? when that tiredness seeps up, it's because we're feeling selfish. Like, why can't I do this for myself? And why do I have to do this for them?
Yes.
Those feelings give that kind of ability that man.
Yeah. That's unnerving. Yeah. You know, I was watching this video, and every time I watch this video and get ready for our class and our time together, I am just constantly shaking my head. You know, I can't believe I said that. I did that. I did that. Really, it's very humbling. I texted Sue and I said, because she's gonna watch this later, but I said, you have to realize this is really humbling. It's humbling for me. You know, I realize how impatient I am with my children. So it's hard to be consistent, even when you want to be and try to be. It's still hard, isn't it? So what do you think we do?
Right in the pen.
Yeah, there's something to that though. I think one thing that, have you noticed that in almost every video, he's always talking about going to the child and having times of confessing or saying, I'm sorry. And I don't think we should ever move away from that. We should not be in a place where we think, because we're not going to be able to do this perfectly. You cannot walk out of our time together thinking, oh man, I better really ship up or I'm in big trouble. Rather it should be, let me do a reset and go back and 1, apologize to my kids, 2, try harder, 3, recognize that it's all about God's grace and mercy to me and kindness to me, and 4, I'm going to have to repeat that cycle over again. You know. Any questions or thoughts? Comments?
Nellie, it's kind of delayed, so Nellie
Yeah.
was talking about what we talked about earlier. Leslie, you're not alone. She said, when talking and discipline don't work, she'll hit back, and in extreme cases, she's bit her son back.
Yeah. Well, okay, so actually, what Nellie just said is not so uncommon. A lot of parents, especially, I know children who are biting other kids, and you know they'll get basically a warning from school because that's pretty serious in a school context. Your child can be totally taken out of school for that, and especially if there's a broken skin and all that. So a lot of parents have fretted over biting. And so I know of parents who have bit their children, not as hard as anything, but really to show them to some extent of what type of pain they're putting on someone else. It has worked. It can work. So it's not so crazy to think of that happening.
I remember watching it like 2020 long time ago, and it was like on discipline children, and the expert was saying that was not a good method. That whatever, copying whatever your child does, like saying that, I'm so long, I don't know why he said or whatever. But
I mean, personally, I agree with that. I don't think it's, even though I said it works, I don't know necessarily if it's the best thing to do. I personally think you still head over towards physical discipline. And I don't know if there's the only reason I say that physical discipline is still better than that is that, 1, nothing in the Bible says that you should do that. It doesn't say bite for bite, eye for eye, bite for bite. But there is something, and we'll talk about why physical discipline, we'll go into that. But I'm just saying that I've seen it work. But just because it works doesn't mean we should do it. And just because it works in the moment doesn't mean it produces the ultimate fruit that we want. Right? So that's another thing.
No, so, I mean, isn't that more just kind of like addressing the behavior?
Yeah, exactly. And that's why it might not be fruitful in the long term, in the end. Well, I do want to go into, Leslie, what you were talking about, because you're not the only one. Like Nellie said, it's not just Nellie, but I know a lot of people who have tried that framework of it. When you think about physical discipline, corporal discipline, and in the manner upon which he was talking about, it's a much more involved process than just simply hitting the child. Because if it was just about that, then that's abusive. And I think he talked about it. And he talked about, well, he talked about why we shouldn't do that. And again, I'll go into that a little later because I want to sort of end with that since that's what we talked about. But I do want to say, though, that when we're in this place of receiving that type of dishonor from your child, if you're not consistently pressing in with discipline on that, you're not just going to see that when they're 2 and 4. You're going to see that when they're, as we talked about last week, when they're 15 and 17, 16. The dishonor is going to grow exponentially as they go along, especially when you do not really address it at an age where you actually have the ability and the authority to actually speak into their lives that way, with that much control. But once they get older, you're going to lose that ability to do that. And you have to really decide, am I going to choose to really work on this at this young age, or am I going to have to deal with it at a much later stage where it'll be significantly greater, the rebellion, the sense of self-centeredness. And D. Carson talked about how, like the space shuttle, when it launches, if it's 1 degree off at the beginning stage, by the time it hits Earth's atmosphere, it's going to be really far off. And that's what essentially you're doing, is you're trying to align this child to be able to view the world through God's eyes and see it under the authority of Scripture. And from there, by the time they grow, they've fostered a real sense of what it means to follow God and to follow you, trust you. Thoughts? Do you see that? Yeah.
I do. But also, just kind of bring up the opposing view.
Mm-hmm.
You know how we're also like, taught to kind of like, well, I don't know if taught, but they said question authority.
Mm-hmm.
And there are times when that's kind of necessary, or kind of was, I guess, I don't know, like, that's kind of like a fine line when
Sure.
they should have the wisdom to like just obey and submit, or when to kind of question.
Right, right. So when does one question authority? And this is, and again, this goes back to a biblical worldview. If we say that there absolutely is a place to question authority, for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was a Lutheran pastor. He really went against Hitler's regime to try to exterminate the Jews and paid for it with his life. Regardless of whether you think his tactic was right or not, which is he tried to assassinate Hitler, but he definitely believed strongly that something should be done against what he felt was a grave injustice. It was the Bible that he used as the ultimate arbiter, judge, and God being obviously the one who gave his word. So therefore, even human authority still rests under what Scripture views as authority. So even though the Nazi government was the German authority, basically he still had to submit to God's government. And so yeah, there are definitely times where you need to do that. But here's the question: is what is the purpose of why we're parenting our children? And I think that was sort of the second presupposition. Is that the first one was that God's word is how we want to parent the means by which we want to parent our kids. The second is that I want my children to love the Lord above all else. If your greatest desire is for your child to go to Harvard, then probably your approach to parenting is going to look different than someone who says, I want my child to follow Christ. Because if it's I want my child to follow Christ and I want him to love him, because I know that by doing so there's a greater fruit and joy at the end of his life and eternally, then it's going to dictate how I parent my children. Does that make sense? So yeah, I agree. There is an authority that sometimes you need to overcome, you might say. But when you do that is the key. But I think you want your child to listen to you when that.
Well, I was just kind of thinking of a totally different subject, which was, that Korean fairy saying. They say, the in Korean culture everybody respects, and they just they're just basically saying that they paid with their life by obeying,
Yes.
so.
Yeah, when you hear that, it is basically the captain said, everyone go back and stay in the ferry, inside the ferry. And all those students basically listened to the captain, even though that guy was an absolute crook. I wonder, though, if it's an issue of, if I was in that boat and the captain said, this is what you need to do to survive, and I had to somehow make a decision, one or the other, and everyone else was heading underneath. Is it an issue of authority or an issue of I don't have enough information to process that? I have to trust the person who has been given what I thought was training to actually lead this. Like on a plane, if the pilot says, you all have to do this, and it might sound a little off, but we're not exactly sure why. Do we trust that or do we rebel? If they said we all have to, pick up a seat and throw it against each other, there's probably, well, wait a second, but but if it's, I want you to stay in the plane, even though it looks like we're going to crash, you need to stay in your seat and don't move. I have a feeling, for me at least, I think I would just sit in my seat. And I don't think it's about me submitting to authority. I think it's just I have to trust. I don't have enough information to process that. So that's why I wonder what that looks like on really. But if we have enough information, sure, we should question it. And I don't think there's anything in the Bible that says we can't do that. I don't want us to think that we're trying to raise robots. We're raising really intellectual, sharp-minded, ultimately thoughtful believers who process everything in the world. But at the same time, as how he talked about, I want my child to be, let's say, a woman or a man who's going to be responsible, who's going to be respectful, who's going to be kind and compassionate, who's going to defend the defenseless, who's going to be able to process the world carefully and wisely, but who's going to submit to God and his view of how life is to be. And sometimes that might mean going against authority. It might mean that, actually. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I know these are great questions, really. And anything else?
Question about, how he was saying a form or a sign of rebellion is when they refuse your help.
Mm-hmm.
But what about, how do you, I think there's a fine line too, because when kids are learning how to do things on their own and they're refusing your help because they want to try to do it on their own, how do you know when to just let them be and let them learn versus take it as rebellion and discipline them?
Yes, that's a great question, Gloria. I think you can tell. Let's say the child is, and this is where I would say alongside with him, if you're not sure, you err on the side of not implementing discipline. So if there's any sense of ambiguity or uncertainty, I wouldn't discipline the child. It's more of when you know that they are intentionally dishonoring you, rebelling against you and your commands. For example, if let's take that illustration about the tying the shoelaces, right? The child is learning. So they're trying to tie the shoelaces, and I say, Elizabeth, let me help you tie your shoelaces. And so I reach down, and she's like, no, let me do it. And I say, okay, I want you to do it, but I'm looking, and let's say I've been watching, and she's really not able to get it, so I'm trying to help her, right? And so I reach down, and she just pushes my hand away. Says, no, I'm doing it myself. See, at that point, it's not about trying to learn how to tie the shoelaces. It's about saying, I'm going to do this my way, and you have no right to be in my life. That's when you know this is more than just about learning. This is about rebellion. And so I feel like you're going to have to play it contextually in the moment. You're going to have to be really wise about it. You know your child best, too. That's another thing, is that I don't know what your child is like. You know your child better. And I think I always can get a sense of when they've stepped over the line. Can you sense that?
Well, when they refuse help, I don't ever feel like they've stepped over the line. It's more like I can do myself, and like putting their own seatbelt on or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I just feel like, and then I say, let me help you
Mm-hmm.
here, and I'll put their hand there and I'll help them push it in, and they're fine. So they've never really gotten to that point.
Right.
But
Right. Okay. This is. I'm not going to make this in any way a standard or say this is how it should be. But I do know that with my children, when I want to do something for them, and even if they oppose it, it's always about how they oppose it. And if they oppose it, I want to hear their reasoning. Now, for a young child, they usually don't have reasons, right? And so that's where you have to realize that they should listen. Should is strong word. Yeah, I believe they should. They should listen to you. They should listen to you. I mean, you are their parent. You know, you are the mom and the dad. They're not the mom and the dad. And you have to really try to assess in your mind, where do you think that child is coming? What's the message they're conveying ultimately? And if you feel in any way that ultimately the message is, I'm going to do things my way, and you have no right to say that to me, and you have no right to help me, then that's when you need to really assess if they've crossed that line of now they've just outright disobeyed you. They just don't want your help, ultimately. It's more about them not wanting your help. And again, that's not an easy, like, okay, this is every definitive case law study. Is it exactly how it is? It's just I think you need to assess it.
When you like this time or learning something, right? Even though they deny your help, personally, I would probably walk away from it. So, let him or her be frustrated with it until he or she gives up,
Mm-hmm.
and then step in and say, I know you're frustrated, you can't do it, but the point they gave up, they figured that they can't tie the shoelace anymore.
Sure.
And then show them.
Yeah.
And like that kind of like shows like leadership and respect. Like, he let me do what I did,
Mm-hmm.
and he respected me too. Now he's showing me the way to do it.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Again, I don't know if it's so black and white in this instance.
Yeah.
But watch for patterns. I wouldn't take it again at the moment, and that one instance means that they're being absolutely defiant. But if they're regularly like that in a lot of different areas, a lot of different ways, and especially over time, you're going to find those patterns to really be an expression of that child's heart. And again, I don't want you to think that, and this is something we talked about last week, is that there's this fear, and I do believe it's an unwarranted fear, that if you discipline your child or sort of direct them and want that child to respect you and honor you strongly, that you're stifling their personality, their creativity, their ability of leadership, all these things. I don't think you can really be a leader unless you know how to do something with all of your energy with discipline. You know what I mean? Like the best leaders and the most skillful and talented people in the world, whether you're Tiger Woods or Bill Gates or, really anyone, is someone who has talent and gifting and creativity, but they've also spent, as Malcolm Gladwell talks about in Outliers, 10,000 hours, perfecting something. That comes with discipline. It's not just about this free-flowing freedom. And when you think about that, even from a purely, just any common grace worldview, that you really do have the ability to lead your child to experience a lot of great things. But I don't think that precludes, hey, you know what, let me help you with this. Let me show you that you have to live under authority. That's a part of your life, ultimately. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Jay, you want to say something?
Well, I think one thing that I'm learning is because you get to see the
different personalities of the children. And in many ways, as it relates to discipline, sort of a one-size-fits-all doesn't really apply, because if I think about the progression of our kids, it's gone, like, I call it mild to, it's like there's a band of discipline, which I've experienced from Dylan, Sydney, and Ian. And so I guess I'm continually learning that one-size-fits-all sort of approach. Like, it may not, in many ways, like, as much as you want to recognize the foolishness and apply the discipline, I think there's different degrees. And it's hard to, it's in real time, so it's a little bit hard to gauge, because you're like, oh, this worked with him, I can it's not working with her, you know, kind of, and vice versa. Right? So it's definitely, in many ways, I feel like God, in many ways, is teaching us through our children about how to establish that right boundary, I think, with our kids.
Yeah, right. And I'm always in our time together, I'm always wrestling with how much to use my own children as examples, because for a few reasons, not just for their sake, but as well, I don't in any way assume that the way that I've done things is, again, the standard upon which it should be done. I could probably point out to you a gazillion mistakes that I've made. And also, sometimes what works for me doesn't necessarily work for you. But there are foundational principles that what we're really working with are the foundational principles. How it plays out practically definitely will take a little bit of a different flavor per family, per couple, per child. And that's reality. That's who we are as God has made us to be. This area of discipline, I will say this, is that, I mean, I have 4 kids who are really different from each other, and I really praise God for Jack, my son. And the reason is because I don't know if I would be able to communicate with some of you who have boys. Because, you know, with my 3 daughters, they were all right. Carissa, she was very strong-willed, but, you know, generally still okay. But Jack is a different animal. I mean, he really is. And so I've always thought that if I didn't have a son, I would always think, you know, you parents with boys, you just don't know how to parent. That's why your boys are so crazy. Until I had my son, then I was like, oh, okay, now I understand. I mean, but fundamentally and foundationally, it's still the same. It's just that maybe what I've had to do 10 times with one child, I have to do 1,000 times with him. And that's where consistency is so important. And I don't have it. I mean, I'll be really frank. I tried to be, and I know Sue and both and I did, but that's why, you know, parenting is still about grace, God's grace to us. Even in our failure, He still uses us. You know? So yeah, I totally agree with you, Jay. But we're still talking about the foundational principles as avenues upon which we parent.
There's this like a huge delay in comments coming in.
Okay.
Gina says, yes, Benji got bit on the cheek at Super Frank's, left teeth marks. And then her question was, which you already addressed like before. It says, when your 2-year-old hits you out of frustration, is the best way to discipline back by spanking, like hitting him back.
Okay. So let's go. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah, Nellie has another one. Nellie asks, can Pastor Sam address the father's role in discipline, because husbands usually are not home and mom does a daily grind? For me, I can be consistent in disciplining. My problem is removing the anger when disciplining. Okay, so let's talk about discipline again. I think that I loved actually the way that he described what discipline is not. Discipline, let me just read it. Discipline is not slapping, pinching, pushing, punching, pulling hair, yanking. And he said, if you do any of this, you are an abuser. And I'll be honest, I mean, if this, I've never punched my children, but I've pinched them before. You know, a little secret. Come on. You know, yank is taking the arm and pulling them along. I've done that before, you know, to try to get them to
I don't think I've never pulled anyone's hair or slapped them. I don't know if I don't think I pushed them, but, and I do think he's right. I think yanking, and when you think about all these things, that's the picture you might have when you think of physical discipline is doing something that is abusive. But really, we're not talking about any of these things. We're talking about a very, very clear-cut process that actually takes a significant amount of time and fighting for a lack of anger. So let's talk about Noah's question, the question of mom and dad. I've heard these type of things quite often where one of the parents will say, "Oh, I refuse to physically discipline my children. It's going to be totally on the other person, and the reason is because when I was a child, my father or my mother hit me, and they really did such damage to me. I can never do that to my child." So that's one reason. Another one I've heard is I'm never home, so of course it's going to be one person. But because now they're in the habit of it's always that one person, that's just how it's always going to be. So they've sort of dealt with it that way. Another one will say, "Oh, you're just better at it. You're calmer. You have a better personality." And so, anyone think of any other reasons? Have I covered them all? There are probably more. A lot more. Physical discipline has to be something that is absolutely in partnership between husband and wife. It cannot be just one person. And the reason is that, first of all, if it's left to one person, because your children, most of the time, for most families, the children aren't always under the care of one person. So, for example, if Sua regularly disciplines the kids because I'm away, but then let's say I'm watching the kids and they're doing something and I'm not ready or able to do that, what message does that send to the children? What do you think? Yeah. What does getting away with it also equate? I mean, it can mean a few things, actually. Think about that. What does that look like?
There's less respect and honor for that parent.
Okay. Less respect and honor for that parent. Well, maybe both parents, in a sense.
Yeah.
Possibly. They might think, "Oh, mom always is the mean one. Dad is the really great one." Think about what that creates between husband and wife, right? When they see the children sort of favoring one parent, and let's say it's because of, so there's that. So it's definitely a mixed message. Also inconsistency, and we already talked about how inconsistency makes it very difficult for kids to gauge what is right and what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is unacceptable. When they think that, oh, under one parent, that they can do one thing, and then under another parent they could do another thing, there's absolutely no, so then the end goal of discipline, remember, was to root out foolishness, which is to see the world rightly. And if they're having a total mixed view of the world based on how you're choosing to opt out in discipline and not be together on this, then it makes them absolutely confused as to what, and the end goal of discipline is can't be brought about. Because my end goal of discipline is not to punish them. And you have to remember that. The end goal of physical discipline is not punishment. If you are ever angry, you must never discipline your child, or that's abusive. That's a real hard thing, isn't it, to do? So I think he talked about it this way. You take a step back. You wait. If you're angry, you cannot hit your child. You can't spank your child. It just shouldn't be done. It should never be done in anger. And if you're doing it in anger, you're not disciplining your child. You're actually doing a negative to them. So I think what you have to remember is that we started out this class by saying parenting is really, this class is going to be a lot about your own heart. When you're dealing with your children, what you're really seeing is, again, the mirror to your marriage, the mirror to your own soul. And so when I'm looking at this child that's really frustrating me, and they've got me so riled up that I just want to give them a spanking because I'm so upset, that just reveals the wickedness of my own soul and the foolishness of my own heart. So I need to pull back from that, take some time, pray about it. Maybe at that point, somewhat the other spouse does need to discipline. And that's another reason why both spouses should be ready to discipline, because when I'm in that place where I don't think I can do this, but that child does need discipline, it's quite possible that one spouse is in a much better frame of mind and not angry, so that they could take over and do the discipline, and I shouldn't be. Does that make sense? So if you're not in this together, now obviously if you're a single parent, that's a different story, but in this regard, we're talking about dual parents. If you have both parents, I really, really strongly suggest and recommend that you work out what it means to discipline your children as a team together, what that looks like. And if you're not ready to do that, then there's going to be some serious challenges in this. So anger, not having anger, and I think that, does that answer the question? Did I answer that?
Well, I have a question. I guess when I hear it, when I listen to the video, it definitely, and also our conversation makes me realize like a lot more about my kids and kind of what they're doing, and like recognizing more instances where it's like, oh, that's rebellion, oh, that's rebellion, and it's interesting because Blair was talking about that case with my kids, how they said they want to do things on their own, and I think when I replay a lot of those instances, I feel like I can see that actually some of the times, it's rebellion. Like for instance, like we'll want Bella to to practice something or to do something, and then we'll try to help her, and then she'll just like, but say it like in a pretty mean way, and just, do it home, and so. But then there are times when I guess before this I would think, well, okay, maybe it's just learning. So I guess how do you? I don't know. I'm just trying to think about like practically, like, is it each time it happens, boom, you go into disciplining mode? Is it is it like stepping back and just trying to figure it out first? And is it, because I can see like more and more instances where it's like, wow, this is going to be like a constant, like almost like every couple minutes kind of thing.
So, Derek, like I said, I raised 3 daughters, right? And again, I don't want to use my kids as a case study, but I want to say that I haven't seen discipline mess up my kids. Like, you both know, my daughters are watching your own kids right now, so if you didn't trust them, if I really messed them up, you would not want them watching your kids, right? And I would say with Chris and Sarah and with Elizabeth, we were very consistent on trying to implement discipline regularly. And you have to understand what that looks like. It's not, get over here, you're going to get a spanking right now. It's not that at all. It's stopping, asking questions. Remember, it's the whole thing. It's if there's a spanking, that's only one small part of the much bigger picture. And I think the way he described it, similar to the way I described it last week, which is you get together. If I was, let's say, Carissa was doing the same thing, I'd start asking those questions. And if she ultimately said, I wanted to do things on my own, apart from you, I would probably say, what I want to do is let's bring it to a private place. I probably would have a conversation, and then I would tell her, if it's something that I felt as though it's not a huge, absolute rebellious reaction, I would go and get my little chopstick or whatever it is, the little thing, and I'd probably say, you're going to get 2 shots. And that, because I want you to know that what I want most from you is that you would trust me, and you obviously don't. It's very difficult for you. And I would do that. She'd probably cry, and then I'd pray with her. She'd pray with me. What's the amazing thing is almost every time after that, it happened more with my daughters than with my son. It's a little different. But almost every time right after that, they would totally be fine. They'd be happy and doing what I asked them to do. They wouldn't be walking around. And that's one thing that he talked about that I think is really critical. Do not let the child run away until that child is free from anger. and your relationship is restored. So the end goal of it is not for that child to walk away downcast and frustrated. And usually when I'm doing this, I do give them a big hug. I do pray with them. I do kiss them. I do tell them I love them so much. And I want them to know how good God is and that Jesus understands, he bore that. So, and when they walked away from that, they usually wanted to actually follow. It's very amazing. It really is. I'm not saying it always works out like that, but when you regularly are consistent with it, you'll find that actually you do that less. And I tell you, you want to fight this battle when they're 2 and 3, not when they're 15. You do not, because at that point, you don't have it. The rod is gone. But at that point, your child is breaking curfew, sneaking out of the house, hanging out with certain good people, and then it can get even far worse than that, as you all can imagine. So, and when you're having those type of conversations, when you're having you have to respect my authority. I'm your father. Do you know what I do for you? Do you know what I pay for you? If you're not going to respect me, then you don't belong in my house. You're going to have that same that's the same conversation as I would have with my little daughter who's 2 or 3. But I'm not going to say it like that to my little daughter. I have the rod, so I don't have to do it like that. But the danger is that I'm going to have that conversation when you're 15. And I don't want to have that conversation. Trust me, you want to be able to still have the heart-to-heart talks. But you can reflect on the same premise of what you used when they were 2 and 3, which is, why are you doing this? What's going on in your heart? What are you pursuing? Where are you finding joy? What? But you've been doing that since they were 2 and 3, so when they're like 12 and 13, 15, they don't have the physical discipline, but their heart has been offended by it. And so therefore, they're processing it in a way in which they trust you. They want your authority because they've always lived under it. And they actually now believe that there's a safe place of living under that. Even though they're probably pressing in on, well, I don't understand, I'm processing the world. So it's all happening concurrently. That makes sense?
So it's basically like, it is trying to catch it at every single moment if you can, and then it's going to lessen more that they're learning.
You will find it will. It will. But at the very least, as they get older, so what you're talking about, we're at the 0 to 5 range, right? Once they hit, if you're consistent on this in 0 to 5, when they hit around 6 to 12, 6 to 11, something like that, it's going to be, they will generally listen to what you say, and they'll be happy about it. We joke about it with Jack and Elizabeth, and right now, as Chris and Sarah will say, they'll all joke about it with each other. Why didn't you just eat it? This doesn't really matter that much. And they're like, yeah, I know, I was dumb then. They can joke about that, but even now they see the foolishness of what they were like. They're themselves. I think that's an awesome thing. But it took a lot of working it through with them, having conversations, regular discipline, and doing it in a way in which they're being, we're praying for them, we're blessing them. Yeah,
I think the hard part is sometimes when I feel like I've had a good conversation or in a discipline moment, I feel like I've said the right things or, brought Jesus into the context. And I think I'm feeling like, okay, he's listening. And then when I end it, his response is like, can I have some ice cream? And at that point, my anger runs over. And then it's the issue of again, it's like, are you just, are you disrespecting my authority? Or is it a kid having this much attention span?
Mm-hmm.
Because every conversation is not going to go where my kids are going to say, yes, mommy, I totally get it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Right.
Absolutely, Leslie. And there are going to be times you will see true brokenness. What we had a hard time seeing with our kids early on is we couldn't tell whether they were crying because they got a spanking or they were crying because they really recognized they're wrong. That was a real hard thing to see. And, we could ask the questions, right questions and you can get literally the right answers, but for some reason you're sort of doubting those answers because it's not. You know how you can see this when between husband and wife, right? Where the husband or wife, usually the husband, will say the right thing, right? But you know they're not really saying what they don't really mean it, even though they say exactly what you want to hear, but it's definitely not what you want to hear, right? Well, kids do that too, and so definitely when that happens, it just takes longer. I mean, there have been times we've said things like, okay, you're gonna go to your room. So sometimes we've had sort of a hybrid. We'll mix, spanking with timeout together, where we'll say after it. Let's say Sarah said the same thing, right? I would probably say, why are you asking for ice cream right now? Did you hear anything that I said? And they would say, whatever. And I'd say, I want you to go to your room. I want you to you're going to sit there. I want you to think about this a little bit more. And you know what's amazing? Again, this is where what you were talking about, I think does hold water, is that each child is different. And I think I shared this before with Jack, being alone. He's such an extrovert that being alone is really painful for him. So sometimes when we send him to a room and he has to sit there, that's when he's most broken. He's like crying and weeping. He'll handle it. He'll be like, oh no, but he gets spanking. But gets into his room, he's bawling. To me, I want both for him. I will never exclude the spanking. I won't exclude the spanking, but I will probably complement it with. So that's definitely different with my daughters. All of them, for them, usually the spanking was enough. For Jack, many times we have to go much longer, much deeper. So it's hard. This is where I'm going to tie what you said, Leslie, back into what Derek was saying, is that the long view is so important. If you're just thinking about the moment, then you'll just want it to be done and just get it over with, right? But you have to remember that you're trying to lead your child to live a life of joy. And part of that is to really trust you. And you also want your ultimate relationship to be one in which there's a richness to it. And part of that is being built up today for when they are now your age and they're parenting their children. You want your children to be able to say, man, my mom and my dad, I respect them so much. I want to honor them. It's not just I want to give them money, because they gave me money, but it's, boy, their wisdom. I want them to give me advice in rearing my own children. How many of us feel that way towards our own parents? Where, yes, please give me a lot of wisdom, a lot of advice. I want you and your children to really have such high regard for you and your parenting that when you are, when your kids are your age, they will really turn to you for that type of wisdom. But that only happens if you have a really long view. So what you're doing in the moment, don't think that it doesn't have repercussions for what is to come in the long term. And even though it's tiring and taxing, the investment is worth it.
I know you touched on it a little bit about respecting. How about if your two parents, husband and wife, ideology and is different of how to like. I got hit as a child, so I'm okay if I need to spank my child. But on the other hand, my wife was never touched, so she's totally against any spanking or anything like that because she was never. She's like, I was raised this way, and we grew up in total different type of households. Mm-hmm. So coming together to just discipline our child. I see, there's going to be issues because she'll be like, whatever he does, he never deserves to get hit. And I'll be like, sometimes you just need to get hit.
Oh, Peter, that is a really, really tough question. Again, I go back to the presuppositions. And if one person doesn't believe in it, then yeah, we're definitely in a place where we're going to hit a roadblock because, again, the presuppositions are the Bible is true. I believe it to be true. I believe it also to be the ultimate path upon which I find my greatest joy, not just in this world, but eternally. And so therefore, because I believe that to be true, whatever it says, I want to follow it. So I believe that as my first presupposition. The second is that I actually want my children to know who Christ is and want to follow him. And so if I have those two premises, then what I would say is, let's say, Vic and I let's say Vic came to me and said, Sam, I don't really believe I should spank my children. I think that's wrong. I think it's absolutely wrong. And I would say, okay, Vic, well, let's go look at Proverbs 23:13, Proverbs 29, Proverbs 13, 24, 19, 18, and then Vic were to say, well, I don't actually believe in the Bible. Then we're at an impasse. Because I can't convince Vic on the basis of, I wouldn't even try. Because I could say, hey, look at my own children. I gave them spankings and they turned out fine. But you could say, hey, but I know this person, they didn't get spankings, they turned out fine. So the real question is, do I actually believe this to be true? And if the answer is yes, and if we both do, and I show you, and you say, okay, I see that. That seems to be there. I trust God's word, so therefore, I'm willing to do that. That's where it all stands. And if there is no commonality in that, then we're at an impasse. And frankly, if I were, let's say, there's more at stake at that point than simply parenting. Because once you say, I don't trust the Bible, then the real question is, I don't trust anything about the Bible. Why should I trust? If I don't trust the Bible about parenting, why should I trust it about the gospel or about eternity, or who God is, or who Jesus is, why he came? Why don't we go trust about the church? And so it really is a slippery slope at that point. So, but if I was really wrestling with my spouse, one thing I would do, I'd pray for him or her. I'd say, Lord, please help us to see things as you would see it. And then I'd be patient. But this is where this is going to be probably one thing that I might say that maybe you might go, whoa. If you and your spouse have a strong disagreement on this issue, I wouldn't discipline my child physically. And the reason is because I really think that ultimately your marriage, so again, if there's layers, it's my relationship to Christ, my relationship with my spouse, and then my relationship with my children. And it's that foundation. And if this is actually turning me away from and breaking apart this and leading me away from Jesus, it's not going to do anything. So rather, I would say, work on that person's relationship to the Lord, you too, work on your marriage, work on your parenting, in that order.
I personally just said to my wife, I think abuse, or not abuse, but spanking your child should be the last result, like the last action to get the desired result. Mm-hmm. So we will cross that bridge when nothing else works. Then
I think spanking has such a negative connotation to it, because I think if you're following what Paul Tripp is saying, you're doing it in a loving manner.
And I
think a lot of people have this negative connotation, that's tied to it, because, I have traumatizing memories of my mom hitting me in anger, and it wasn't done the way in that the Bible asks us to, or the way Paul Tripp outlined. And so I think done in a right manner, it doesn't have to be negative.
Yeah, like the way he went through the steps, like don't do it out of anger, take it to a private place, talk to them what's going on, try to get them to acknowledge their things and all that. At the same place I see at the same place as I can see it in my wife's eyes, right? She was never hit, so that's never kind of been an option. There's always you can drive results without getting hit. And then I think too at the same point is professionally she's a first grade teacher. So if she hits her child and other parents hear about it, it can cause a whole a whole other issue. Right? No, she's a teacher, but if she even, I mean, professionally, if she did something privately in her home and it came out later, you know, that could result to disciplinary action at work.
Well,
But you know, it's possible that she may not realize that this is what the Bible says, because I mean, I'm sure I read these verses a long time ago, but you know, at that time I didn't have children. I don't know, it kind of went off the year, but I just kind of, it was a really good reminder. This is what the Bible teaches, and I had forgotten. And actually, my family's opposite, because I don't think my husband was really hit that much, but he's the one that's hitting my kids, and I'm the one that grew up, you know, and then I believed in speaking until I had my own kids that I couldn't really do it. And then I heard all these things about, you know, child experts saying how this promotes violence and it's not good. So I was, you know, it was really our disagreement too, you know, until, you know, this is what the Bible says. And, you know, he kind of talked about the way it should be done. And now I kind of realized that this is okay.
Mhm.
So maybe she doesn't really realize it either.
Yeah, I think she has to get to that point.
Yeah. Or maybe exactly what what you're saying is that, and what Julia, you're saying is that the perception of physical discipline is anger, you know, red face, slapping across the face. I mean, it's a very strong, vivid image. Even like you said, words such as hit, maybe even spanking. There's this idea of just, you know, someone just really going nuts. But we're talking about a real, loving, gracious, even-tempered, prayerful, and when I say loving, I mean, you know, you are hugging and embracing that child afterward. And I tell you, have you ever experienced this before? Anyone where you give you give physical discipline, and then at the end of it, you pray for that child prays, and they actually are happier than they were before? Because that happened to me quite often, many times. Whereas this is what happens without it. I'll show you what has happened to us many times. Many times. Child is refused to eat at the dinner table, right? And you know, we're saying, come on, eat, you have to eat. No, I'm not going to eat. And rather than just going, and this is our inconsistency, rather than going straight to physical discipline, we'll just keep on trying to, come on, please eat, no, and then boom, food onto the floor. And then I'm really upset, or Sue is really upset. And we're like, now we're yelling at the child, you bet, do you know what you've just done? You know how much we worked for this? You know, and we're now really upset, and that child is screaming and crying, and doing the salmon breach, and doing all this stuff, and you know, we're just like, by that point, if I bring that child to physical discipline, I'm abusing that child, because I feel worked up already, right? I should have done it when in the very beginning, and probably they would have just came back to the table and eaten the food. But now I'm so worked up, that child is now screaming and yelling. And you know, when parents talk about, well, why are so many couples, and again, I've counseled so many couples these days, especially with 2 children, young children, because that type of atmosphere is so tense that it now creates a natural tension between husband and wife. Because especially if I'm saying, well, look what you did, you yelled at him. You know, you start going back and forth, and now it's blown up, and you're not even talking to each other. The child is going crazy. The house is just in shambles, and suddenly it's not about the child. It's now about husband and wife. That's why I'm saying it's all interconnected. So imagine if you just actually, at the very outset, said, you know what, we're going to have to go into the bathroom. And you take that child, you say, listen, I told you, give it physical discipline through the whole process of everything. That child comes out, says, all right, I'm ready to eat. That's a very different picture.
You're saying that every time you discipline, there's always going to be physical discipline associated with every mistake they make. That's what I'm getting.
When they were really young, they could not understand rationale. Like I said, Vic, I confessed this early. There were many times I failed. So in other words, I've been inconsistent. Both Sue and I have. I will say that there probably have been times I've disciplined out of anger, and that was sinful, and I've had to apologize to our kids about it. I'll ask them today. So I think I asked them recently because of this class. I said, "So you remember any times of your spanking?" And they'd be like, "No." Well, then they would start laughing about one or two incidences of each other, not themselves, and they But I would say generally, with the most we possibly could, we tried to be consistent. But it definitely wasn't always there. And then as they got older, we definitely slowly started fading out physical discipline. Like to now where really it's a very rare thing for Jack. I mean, everyone else would never do it. And so now we're able to have those conversations. But yeah, it was a mixed. It started though at the early ages. Yeah, it was just physical discipline with conversation and mixed into it.
Yeah, I would say, now that Arden is almost turning 6, it's definitely less and less, and I hardly ever. And I had a conversation with you. I asked him, when was the last time I hit you? And he was like, a long time ago. But it just so happened, I think it was just last week, where, it's always that time when I'm cooking and they're running around going crazy, and he has this thing about scaring her, like running up to her, like scaring her, just to kind of enforce his authority over her, and it's that whole alpha thing, and so I told Arden stop. I don't know how many times, and he didn't stop, and so I was like, all right, Arden, next time I have to tell you to stop, I'm gonna have to hit you. And so he stopped that moment, but then the next day they would do that exercise again, and I was like, okay, Arden. I took out the spatula, and I had no warning, and I gave him a few swats, and he bawled and bawled, and I think that's the hardest thing for a parent to to have to inflict any kind of physical pain. I mean, sure, it wasn't that bad, but
it wasn't that bad.
Yeah, but I mean, it's painful. I mean, you think as a parent, that's gonna cause almost like a rift or whatever, but after that thinking, 2 seconds, he was totally fine. And then that night when I was putting him down, I asked him what was his favorite part of the day, what was his least favorite part of the day. And when I asked him for his least favorite part of the day, I was kind of like when I spanked him. Like in my mind, that was totally, that was it. Didn't even remember it. Like he said something like totally, it was like really like it was not even like anything. Like he was like when you, so point being that you do what you have to do, but you don't have to fear spanking. It's not, at the end of the day, when you do it in a way that's fruitful, you don't have to be fearful that
it will not break your relationship. It will not ruin your relationship.
I think the key, like you were saying, like when you did hit out of anger, or it's you got to get to the situation before you get to that red line.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
You're kind of approaching it, but then before you actually hit that point, that red zone where no matter what you do, everything's going to be terrible.
Yes, exactly. But you need to realize, I think we all don't realize how quickly we hit that red line before, and we're already there, and we don't realize it. You might even be like, I'm not angry! So what, Julia, you pointed out something that I think is so essential. One is discipline does not break relationship, it restores it. If it's done in a Godward, grace-centered fashion. The point is restoration. The point is not alienation. And so don't ever think that you're trying to, again, it's not about punishment. It's not about trying to get them to do what you want because you want to enslave them. It's because you want to free them. And that's the whole point. I really like what he said is that you want that little child to associate foolishness with pain. Because if they don't do that then, they won't have that when they're an adult. Now think about this. I have counseled many a parent of older children. When I say older, I mean 30-year-old children. And I'm intentionally using that word children because a lot of times it's a man. I know a number of them who are literally at home. The parents give them all the money that they need. They have a nice car. They don't have a job. They play video games all day, hang out with their friends, play basketball. They say, you ask them, well, what do you want to do for a living? Oh, I want to be a sports agent. I want to be a Wall Street banker. They've never studied in their life, right? They don't know anything about discipline in anything. And that parent, I've you don't know how many, I've counseled a number of them who have come to me and said, please help me. And when I talk to them about what they've done when they were young, I can recall one mom who said that every time their son got into trouble at school, she would go to school, talk to the teacher, and try to smooth things over for him so that he could get through. He graduated high school without really knowing how to read and write. But yet his mom was able to, every time he failed a test, would go in and try to talk to the teacher and have those parent meetings and really get it so that the teacher would pass him along. And what that child never got, which is, if I were to explore probably into the very early years of 0 to 5, is they never got the sense of foolishness equals pain. And it should be, that's what you're instilling into your child is, when you do not live in accordance in the ways upon which God has ordained the world to be, and you don't experience pain because of it, eventually it will catch up to that person. Eventually, whether it's 2 years old, 10 years old, 15, 35, 50, eventually that foolishness will play itself out, and you'll see, you could track back almost, their whole life they've never experienced pain because of foolishness. And now they're just living foolishly, period, their whole life. So what you're doing is, there's something to God's word. It's not just God saying, oh, you know what, here's how it is. I just want you to follow me because this is the way you should do it. Do not withhold discipline from a child, Proverbs 23:13-14. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die, which is what you just talked about. Julia, if you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. When the wickedness increase, transgression increases, but the righteous will look upon their downfall. So as they continue their foolishness, it's just going to keep on building on itself because they've never experienced any sense of, this is wrong. So what you're doing today is sowing the seed of saying that my action is, and lack of wisdom is actually causing harm to me. And I don't want to live like that. That's what you're trying to convey in that moment. Eventually, what the great thing is, when you do that from 0 to 5, slowly you're going to find that you won't have to do that because now their conscience is seared. So now when they're 6 and above, they're already feeling like when they do something wrong, they feel guilty. And that guilt is now the pain. Right now at 0 to 5, they don't really feel guilty. They just do it because they just want to do it and they're going to act it out and nothing is stopping them. Later on, this is wrong. I should not do this. This is against God. This is against his commands. My parents told me this is not what I should do. So that's what you're shooting for. And I know it's hard to believe that this can happen. This is where faith comes into play. You have to believe that this is actually how it is. If you don't, it probably won't happen. But if you do believe it, then you'll be consistent, and then you'll see the fruit of it. You will see the fruit of it.
I would say that, to answer one of your questions, definitely when, we discipline our kids, I can see that, afterwards they're really actually much more happy. They actually come out of it like really, submissive and just wanting to obey, and also just much more happy. They're always telling me, "Oh, Daddy, I love you." Like after it's just like spank them,
Yeah.
So it's really that's really interesting. I see that with my kids. I would say, like, for me, one of the progressions that happens at our dinner table is that, and this is one of the reasons why I'm like kind of trying to figure out, like, okay, do you just do it right away or how many times you do it? Because the progression usually is eat this, no, and then okay, discipline time, get up, okay, I will, and then still stalling, eat it, No. Okay, get up. All right, that's it. No more, right? And then, no, okay, I will eat it. I'll eat it. And then after a while, then it's, it's good. Okay, fine. That's it. Boom, go into this one. But it was like, I could have done it like, 5 minutes prior. And I'm wondering, should I have just done it at that moment when I saw the, or is it, because I almost feel like I'm threatening and they're calling my bluff. So.
Yeah. Well, again, children, they know a lot of things without intentionally being manipulative, but they see your response.
Right.
They say, no. And you're like, okay. And so they pull back, and then they move forward again. And it's this constant.
Yeah.
What you're trying to do is get them to go beyond that. And partly, Derek, I would say, and this is something that I think through this class and through Paul Tripp's teaching, I've learned, which is I need to have more conversation. As I didn't have enough conversation with my kids. The why, what's going on with you? Yeah, it's a pain to do that all the time. But you have to, again, believe in the fruit of it. So it's not just about, all right, that's it, it's time. It's what's going on?
At the dinner table?
Yeah, even at the dinner table.
Why, what are you feeling?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
Yeah. Why are you not? Do you not like mommy's food? She worked really hard to make this food for you. Is it? Do you know actually you need to?
Why wouldn't
you? You need to eat this, and we want to provide this for you. It protects you. It feeds you. What is going on? And give her opportunities to respond. And say, who knows? Maybe it could take just a conversation, and after that, she might start eating. Because maybe you're seeing, especially maybe for Bella, she's slowly coming out of the. As she gets older, she might comprehend more of that type of discussion, so that she might just start eating. You'll. So I would.
Bella definitely does. It's Maddie that's the. Problem one right now.
Okay.
Yeah, usually it's, if you don't eat it, Daddy's gonna eat it, and I am just eating it. So I don't know if that's good.
Think of this. Imagine this. Anything you do
so good.
is a message. Because they're watching you all the time. You have the NSA in your house called children, and they're literally watching your every move, and they're watching your every response. And they know that when you respond a certain way, how you respond, they can respond to you in a certain way, which will get a certain response. So you have to always think, what am I conveying by this? I know this sounds hard, but if you don't do this, again, I go back to this reality, and it is a reality. If you don't do it now, you're going to do it when they're teenagers and when they're 20 years old. When they get married and they find a guy or a woman, and you're like, I don't want you to marry this person. What are you doing? Well, if they don't trust you, and because for their whole life they've pushed you around, why would they ever trust you later on when they're older? They're going to push you around then too. They're just going to keep on pushing you. They already know, I can push the limits with my parent. My dad, my mom, they don't really. Why should I respect them? You can sort of understand why kids do end up having a lack of respect for their parents. They've never had it from day one. So it's something to keep in mind. And I know it's hard, Derek, when you're thinking about, oh man, do I have to have a conversation all the time? And sometimes if you're really warm, maybe you might have to step out and have the other parent have the conversation. Again, that's why there is a grace to having a father and mother versus just one. And if it's just, that's why I always say, if you're a single parent, especially if you're a single mom, it's the most difficult job in the world because you bear a lot. But if you're two, sometimes you can tag team. If you're too tired, pass the baton. Let the other person do it. But not all the time. Any questions or thoughts?
When they're disciplined, how you spank, and then he said also interview a child and talk to them. So does it matter which order comes first? Do you spank first and then interview, or interview first?
Yeah. So okay. So I'll share with you again what I used to do was I would basically ask those questions. I'd bring the child into the bathroom or whatever room, maybe another bedroom or whatever it might be, and I would ask questions. What's going on? Why are you doing what you're doing? So the interview, to me, I do it then.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, whatever, again, based on the degree of the rebellion, I would try to I mean, it was arbitrary. It wasn't say, I didn't have a piece of paper that gave me, 2 shots equal this, 4 shots. It would be arbitrary based on what I felt as though was equivalent to what happened. And to me, the number one infraction of all is lying. There is one thing that even today we would spank our kids for, and it's lying. Probably not our oldest kids, but definitely our 2 youngest. We would spank them for lying, because once lying comes into play, you've lost a lot. That's one thing you do not want your children to think they can get away with, because if they get away with lying, it's one thing if you say, did you chew that gum? No. Then why is your tongue red? Because then they start building on the lie, because I licked a red sticker. Well, where's the red sticker? I ate it. And if it just keeps on going, then that's really troublesome. But I would rather deal with that than, where were you last night? I was at my friend's. I called your friend. Well, actually, I was at a party. Where? And you keep on going down the line, right? You don't want your child lying when you're 15 years old, because there are a lot of repercussions there. So for me, lying was the worst thing that they could do, and everything else was underneath that. And that's how significant I saw lying to be. No matter how bad it was, lying was the worst. And from there, I would say, after interviewing them, finding out where their heart is, and I would say, oh, I'm going to give you this many strokes or whatever, shots or whatever you want to call it, hits. And it would usually, and I shared this last week, but it was usually with a sort of a thin, I really like a thin stick, because I think that it doesn't really, it hurts a lot, it stings without doing much damage. It's like a chopstick. I use chopsticks quite often. One chopstick. One chopstick doesn't, it actually does hurt to get hit with a chopstick, but it doesn't do any damage really. So I use the chopstick, or sometimes I would use the wooden spoon handle. It would be like a thin rod. And then afterward, I would put them on my lap. And when they were really young, I would do this. I'd put them on my lap, and I would hold them tightly, and I would say, I want you to know that I love you so much. I don't want to give you spanking. I told them that. I hate giving spankings to you. I have no desire to do this whatsoever. But I want you to know that you need to listen to us, because we protect you, we guide you. And when you don't do this, he called it the circle of safety, but for me it was sort of, it doesn't allow me to protect you in the way that I need to, the way that God has called me to. And that's the thing, when I bring God in, it's not to say God told me to punish you. It's to say that God gave me the privilege of protecting you, of guiding you, of leading you to find your greatest joy and freedom. But when you go and step out of that, I can't do what I can do to help you, and I also can't receive that grace from God, whatever that looks like. They didn't always understand what I was saying. So when they were 1 or 2 years old, or 2 years old, whatever, I didn't expect them to understand anything. I didn't care though, I just said it anyway, because they will understand eventually. And I really believe children understand a lot more than we realize. That's another factor. So I said that, then I prayed with them. Sometimes I did ask them to pray too. I gave them a big hug, and I said, I just want you to know Daddy loves you a lot. I'm always going to be there for you. I'm always going to protect you. Give them a hug. And I'd say, let's go have fun. And they would just run off. And I wanted to hear them say, I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry for what I did. And I'd say, if they said, I'm sorry, I'd say, what are you sorry for? And they'd say, I didn't obey you. I didn't listen to you. And I have to trust that sometimes, I'm not sure if they fully understand that, but that's okay. Because eventually it does click. It usually ends with them running away really happy and just going off and doing, and I think, like you said, Julia, they don't, if it's done well, they usually do not look at that experience as this terrifying experience that's a really bad thing at all. Does that help?
Yeah. One last thing. sometimes I just say like, oh, if you don't do this right now, Daddy's gonna get really mad. Like, and I don't know, because I think John, like, discipline a lot, like, not the right way, And then, but I mean, you think that's kind of okay to do something like that, or?
Again, Eileen, what I would always think, always ask the question, when I say something, what am I trying to say, or how is that child receiving it? So what am I saying? How are they receiving it? So if Daddy's gonna get really mad, what I'm saying is that I'm offloading my ability to, almost like I'm going to put the onus of responsibility on the other person. And then the other person is the bearer of the mad. Because remember, the whole goal is you're not trying to be mad. Discipline is not about anger. And actually, if you'll never want to get to a place where you think it's anger is the impetus upon why you're doing something.
I think when you say that too, it sends the message to the child, like, I'm okay with it, but your dad's going to be mad about it. Even though you're not okay with what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's what you're hearing. Like, oh, mom's okay if I do this, but then dad's going to beat me for it. So I can get away with mom, but I can't get away with
Yes, that is true. And that's something that we need to consider.
Nellie asked if we'll go over when your child has conflict with other children.
How do you stop fighting?
Okay, so on the biting issue, I really do think that that's where physical discipline comes into play. Not biting, but physical discipline. Same thing. The same process is the same. You just have to have that conversation. And you need to constantly say, you know what are you doing? When you bite that child, you're hurting them. Here's the problem is that a lot of kids cannot understand that what pain that brings to the other child. And so I would link that to a few things. One is physical discipline, so therefore when they bite someone, they get a spanking, and that's connected. And if they do it again, you increase the amount. So I would also withdraw as well privileges, such as, because that child is biting, obviously it leads to a disassociation with people because you can't be in a safe context. Actually, what happens is that people don't want to spend time with you as a family. Did you notice that? If you're biting my child, I don't want to do anything to do with you, period, as a parent. It's hard, right? Now, granted, that's my flesh talking. My heart, the pastoral side says, no, show grace and work it out. But boy, it's hard. It's hard if your child is biting my child, and I don't feel like you're taking adequate steps to address that. I have to talk to you as parents to say, your child's biting my child. This is serious, right? And so I would link that as well to possibly withdrawal of privileges, such as you're not going to be able to spend time with other kids. Recognize
the reason is because they don't want to spend time with you anyway.
It's funny. My wife, like, he bites her. Like, when he tries to bite her arm, right? So my wife, like, did like a switcheroo, and he was trying to bite her arm. She like put his arm out, and he bit his arm.
Oh. Did it work?
No,
it doesn't work. Yeah.
I know why he's biting. He's frustrated.
Yeah.
It's like an act of frustration.
Yeah.
But
Let me address Nellie's question really quick because it's a really important one. How many of you have had an instance where you've had really a big trouble with someone else's child towards your child? Anyone face that yet?
Yeah. Small here and there, small.
Small here and there, small.
Yeah.
Like just. What about bigger? Not small, but bigger. Where it really got you, it really impacted you.
Not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, it's coming.
I'm sure
It's coming. You have?
Dylan was a lot younger. And it was hard because it was close friends. And Dylan was always getting hit.
So how did you address? How did you resolve that? Or how did you address it?
Stop playing.
I don't know.
A lot of people address it that way, though. You know that, right?
It was more like we were frustrated.
Did you ever talk to them, the parents?
Not in a confrontational manner where we sat down and that was like the topic, but it would come up. But it's hard when the other parent makes excuses for the child.
Yes.
Or sometimes wouldn't acknowledge it.
Yes, you're right.
Pretended that they didn't see.
Yes.
You know.
There's two types of parents in that scenario. There's the one parent that makes excuses for their child. It's never the child's fault. There's the other parent that is proactive and says, I need to go have a talk with my child. And you can usually see it way before that happens, actually. Usually, if, let's say, there's a community group held at your house, and some parents, they're just like, their kids are going nuts in your house, right? Breaking this, and you're just sort of walking around, you're like, oh, is everything? Let's play nicely, touch gently, And the parents are just sitting there talking and laughing. They see you going all around. They don't say anything. They're like, let kids be kids. They're just going to break your things. It's no big deal. And then there's the other parent that has already had a conversation before they went to the house and said, listen, we're going to this house. You're going to have to, you're not going to run around. You have to be respectful. We've been invited. It's a privilege to be there. And so therefore we really want. And then while you're there has to be all these momentary corrections because they forget that. That goes out the window. They start doing it, and then you're there saying, hey, watch out, no stepping on the furniture, come down from there. And so they're proactive already. You could see that. So there's those two types of parents. So they're usually, next time you go to any group context where you have a bunch of kids, I want you to observe the parents. And observe the child and observe their parents. You're going to see one of those two examples. And when you see that, you recognize already that some parents have the idea that, well, my child must respect other people. And the way that they respect other people is to respect their property, their things, or even themselves. And that is going to also play out in the relationship between children. Because if there's a conflict, my first response isn't to go to that other child and say, hey, what's wrong with you? But it's to first deal with my own child and say, did you do anything that incited this? Because a lot of times we can step into a conflict between two children, and I might have seen a punch, but what I didn't see was all the egging on of my child instigating that child over and over and over and pressing. Finally, that kid just went boom, And I just come in and see the punch, but I didn't. And you might say, well, but my child didn't punch him. But my child is guilty because they've been. Their heart is there. Remember, we're dealing with the heart. The action is only an expression of the heart. So if my child is making fun of this kid and prodding them and pushing them and verbally even, and they respond with one punch, I would say that, yeah, that child shouldn't have punched my child, but my child is at least just as guilty. And so it doesn't excuse my child from that conflict. This is where conversation between two parents are really essential, but the problem is we don't want to have that conversation with parents because we're afraid to lose their relationship. We feel bad. We don't know how to do it in a good way because it can come off heated. The most sensitive area, you can say anything about me, just don't say anything about my kids. It's sort of the mentality we have, even as Christians, and there's something wrong about that. So I think to address Nellie's question, I would say, first, you always have to remember your child is not perfect. They are a sinner too, and they're foolish too. So but before they even got into that conflict, you have to really wonder, did you have conversations with your own child? Have you taught them respect and honor? Did you understand? I don't want my son to ever hit a girl, even for fun. We teach him that. And if he hits a girl, it's hard because he has 3 girls in our house, right? But he is not allowed to touch his sisters in that way. I mean, Elizabeth's sort of like a tomboyish, so they wrestle a lot. But once it gets to fists or something, if he hits her, he gets a spanking for that. Because I want my son to be a defender of women, not someone who's going to abuse women. It happens as a young child. So fathers of sons, a lot of that's on you. You have to be the one who says, you're never touching a girl that way. You respect and honor, you protect. You don't abuse, you don't hit. things like that. So it's a big thing. There's a lot going on than just the fight itself. So be aware of that and have conversation. If you ever see my children doing anything that you feel is inappropriate or something that I give you full license, come and talk to me about it and say, I noticed this, I have a concern for you. Please just state, I'm concerned for you, I love you, I care for you. That's why I'm telling you this. Right? And I'm like, all right, maybe it really could be true. And I need to really investigate it. Another thing is, don't assume that what someone says to you is absolutely true. You have to say, I'm going to look into that. I need to look into that. And that person should be totally fine with you just saying, I'm going to look into that. Because they could have jumped into without the context, right? They could have seen the punch without the egging on. So if you just went up to your child and just started railing them and said, you're going to get physical discipline, because you punched them, maybe they might need to anyway, but you need to hear the whole story. You need to really investigate what happened. And if it is your child's fault, there should be consequences, physical. They should go and physically go up to that child and say, I want you to apologize to that child for what you did. Own up to it. And that type of response and the ownership of it, you will see that play out in a good way when they're adults. Because that means they'll take responsibility for their actions. That's a really good thing. And when they do that, it will save them heartache. If they can say, it's my fault, I take ownership. Those people tend to be leaders. They're going to be the ones who are up in the front saying, follow me, because they're willing to say, it's not all about blame shifting. I'm going to lead by strength. Let us close in prayer. Father, thank you for being with us, for giving us your word, which we're told is lamp unto our feet. Without it, we would be lost. But we thank you that you have provided many means by which we can really honor you. And I especially pray for all the parents in this room and watching, and I pray that you would bless them, give them much joy, and help them to see and delight in Jesus, and to lead their children to do the same. Lord, it's not just our children. We as well have been bound up in our hearts with foolishness. But that is exactly why Jesus had to die on the cross. He needed to be a fool so that we can be freed from our foolishness. May we know that that's what saves us and saves our children ultimately. We're just leading them toward that end. But only you can save. So I pray for that wisdom, Lord, upon every man and woman here. So we bless your name. We thank you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.
Jim? Yeah, my house right now. That's why right after the talk, we go back. So we have
I know that he knows that that's not right. But if it was totally unjust, like for example, this kid was just picking on him because he was a bully, I think that it's a tough call. I mean, right now, for example, some kids in our church, a lot of them are taking jiu-jitsu and things like that. He is too, And partly, I really want him to be a defender of the defenseless. And I want him to defend his sisters and as well as anyone who's innocent, even if it was for the cost of his life. But I also don't want him to be a bully or use any strength or power he has to oppress, to be an oppressor. And so we don't ever allow him to use any of his moves on our daughters. And he's not allowed to. If he does, he's in big trouble for that. So it's a tough call because if, let's say, someone was really kicking and trying to pummel him, I think there is a place to defend himself. You know? But I wouldn't want him to be the instigator, you know, and the one who's. Actually, even Mitch, who's the they call it master at jiu-jitsu, he tells them first reaction in a fight, run away.
Mm.
You know, it's not about trying to beat this guy up, and you know he can beat up a lot of people, Mitch. But his whole point is you're not trying to win, you're trying to defend yourself. And so if you really have an opportunity to walk away, walk away. But if you're in a position where someone is physically threatening you, I do think, and I think Scripture would lay this out, that there is a place to actually defend yourself for that. Don't you? Would you agree? Yeah. So I wouldn't want him to be the instigator, though. Yeah. 0 to 5. You all are in a very, joyous journey. But you never had someone say that. I hope it's been fruitful, at least this 0 to 5. We'll see. If you try it out. See, I mean, but when I say try it out, you gotta actually be consistent, try it out for a while. It's not about going home and saying, all right, we're gonna do things new today. It is about saying, here's what we're doing, why we're doing it.
Why are you crying? I know you can't respond back. Why are you crying? Just to get into heaven.
Yeah. That's good.
Come on, be a man.
Be a man.
Boys don't cry. My mom said that. She was telling that to my wife the other day. She was like, I used to tell Peter that he wasn't supposed to cry when he was a kid because he was a boy. So at church, when he would get hurt, I would always go like, hold it in, hold it in, hold it in.
So can you give an example of like, you know, you have certain things that are like 2 strikes. Is there like a range, like 0 to like 10 or something like that, or in terms of like number of strikes? Because I always just thought it was like 1. I don't know. I just let's do 1 big one, but like I like that. Multiple ones with like different degrees.
Yeah, but to me, degrees helps because let's say, for example, there was an instance where someone was where one of the kids was doing something and they repeatedly did something.
Right.
It would show that with each time and each disobedience over the same thing, that there would be some sort of consequence that would be worse than the first. And to show, and so it generally started out small, but would increase as I felt as though, unless it was something like lying. I would say up front, if you lie, you're going to get 5 or whatever.
Right.
And also for me, crying was essential. I think I told you this. If they didn't cry, because what he said, I mean, literally, that kids are almost wearing Kevlar. When it comes to, they won't feel anything. And if they don't feel anything, they have to equate the discipline, the pain, with their foolishness. If there's no pain, then there's no gain. There's no sense of, well, I didn't do it. It doesn't hurt. Well, they'll probably laughing.
Do you think like so you know how there are like other ways of discipline too, right? Like besides the rod, like hey, there's holding things and whatnot. Like if the pain comes from something else, like more than like let's say it's isolation or whatnot, then is that not pain, or is it usually? I mean, you also want physical pain as well.
Again,
I guess you're answering that.
Yeah, it depends on
Early on.
Because the younger they are, they don't understand certain things. So the one thing that they understand at a real young age is pain is something they know, period. Everything else,
I don't know.
They said no ice cream. They might,
I think it's coherent. I think it's more.
but no ice cream might hurt too.
Yeah.
That'll be great, right? So yeah, you'll see.
I know Bella, like, as soon as, like, bring her over to the bathroom, sit her down,